Hi there, this is Anne Marie, the anti-HR lady, and today I wanted to have a little chat with you about DEI and why I think it is extremely harmful to people of color and specifically Black people and especially Black women. So, what I want to make clear is that I am sharing my thoughts based on 20 plus years of overseeing HR as well as managing DEI activities at multiple organizations, up to and including in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, where everybody and their father was yelling, in corporate America was claiming that they cared so much about Black people and Black Lives Matter, and everyone was hiring DEI people left and right. And that's about the time I decided to exit human resources because I was not interested in being used as a puppet and as a prop and as a mascot to cover up and gloss over bullshit, to be blunt. And that's about the time in 2020 when I decided, in summer 2020, when I decided that it was going to be time for me to exit corporate America permanently, which is what I did by the spring of 2021, and also exited the United States of America. I now live abroad. But what I want to say to you guys, especially people of color, is DEI ain't for you, boo. All of what I saw relevant to DEI, how it was talked about, how it was instituted at institutions and organizations, was about making it palatable for white people. And there was a significant focus, in my view, on having DEI talked about diversity, equity, inclusion in contexts that make white people feel comfortable, that no one wants them to feel bad, no one wants them to feel uncomfortable. And in many cases, I've even witnessed DEI and DEI terminology being used as a weapon against Black people, specifically Black women in corporate management roles, are often, I experienced it myself, being told that you're not being inclusive, which I think is an interesting spin. I'm sure you all many of you may know about the recent report that was put out where it was found that 80% of the people hired to do DEI are white. A majority of them are white, and most of them are white males, followed by white women. So, of course, what that tells me is that there really is no change that's going to take place in an institution where they are claiming to have DEI activities if the people leading the activities are also the people who are primarily the perpetrators of the harm, not just at work, but play and everywhere else. The other issue is that most of DEI activities sit in human resources. And that, in my view, is a big red flag. If you want to know whether DEI is going to be effective, the two things you need to look at is how much of a budget or any budget it has. The second thing is where it sits, who it reports to. And the third thing is whether or not it has any staff beyond the DEI director. And you will find in most of nonprofit world, as well as in corporate America, that DEI is underfunded. It sits in human resources and reports through human resources. And they usually may have one person and maybe an assistant overseeing the program, which means that it really isn't properly staffed, it's not properly funded, and it's not intended for it to really do anything or to institute any change. In order for DEI to be effective, it has to be focused on addressing issues of racism and discrimination and bias in the workplace, addressing the issues in the context of who the perpetrators of them are, instituting levers of accountability, up to and including, you got to give people incentives to do the right thing, but you also have to be clear that you're willing to take people's jobs away or take bonuses away or have other hammers in addition to incentivizing people to follow policies. So if you are only talking about DEI in terms of unconscious bias, then you're not serious about DEI, because the fact of the matter is that bias is not unconscious. People know that racism is wrong. They engage in it anyway, right? So addressing it as just an issue of unconscious bias is not a serious approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which you will see in most organizations is the approach that they take. because that's your way of telling white people that, yeah, you're racist, but you don't really mean to be. So, don't feel bad about it. And it's not really you, it's just society. Well, you're part of society. So in fact, it is you. And it's not just a question of not knowing at this point. It's a question of not wanting to know, because all the information that anyone would need to know about systemic racism, white supremacy, America's history of being racist from its very inception up to today is very available. The internet is free. The library is free. If you don't know these things, it's because you don't want to know them, right? And so when you come into workplaces and they want to talk about DEI in terms of unconscious bias, or they want to talk about it in the context of value proposition, is that we should do it because it makes sense from a bottom line perspective. Those are all problematic ways of thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, because you're not thinking about it from a social justice perspective. You're not thinking about it from the perspective of the people who have historically been harmed by racism and discrimination. And you're not talking about the foundation of racism and discrimination in the United States specifically, which is anti-Black racism. Everything else flows from that. All the other isms flow from anti-Black racism. And so if you're not willing to talk about those things and talk about them in the context of that type of harm, you're not serious. And in most American corporate workplaces, they want to talk about DEI in ways that all, kind of downplays where the source of the problem is, who the source of the problem is, and how to institute levers of accountability to address those issues, right? So a lot of times you will see people trying to use the very terms around DEI, around bias and inclusion and who's being inclusive and who's not, against people of color, right? Rather than focusing at where it belongs, because on who it is that actually holds power and control in an organization, who makes the decisions about who gets hired, who makes the decisions about who gets promoted, and how are they making those decisions? Are they making those decisions in an unbiased manner, or aren't they? And why are they making those decisions that way? What is the root cause of it? Where does it come from? And so on. And being very clear about what the historical what the history of it is and what the historical impact, as well as what the impact is currently, because it continues to have an impact even now around decisions about who gets hired, who gets fired, who gets promoted, who gets opportunities, and so on. So one of the issues why I say DEI is not for us is because all of it is very much focused on making one group of people feel comfortable in their bullshit that they engage in every single day at the expense of the people that it's actually supposed to be there to help. As I said before, if DEI is in HR, then how do you expect it to actually be accountable when HR is not historically accountable and is not accountable right now? HR is also an instrument of the institution. It exists to protect the institution. So when you sit DEI under HR, and DEI, if it's practiced properly, is really supposed to be holding a mirror up to an organization and telling it where it's going wrong and what it needs to do, how it needs to be accountable, and what it needs to do to address issues of diversity, equity, inclusion for underrepresented and underserved employees. How are you going to do that if it's in HR? When you have issues and concerns about discrimination, and some people have come to me as clients and said, I went to the DEI person in HR and nothing happened. And I'm like, of course nothing happened, because then they are just another instrument of the institution to protect the institution. In my view, DEI should be reporting to the president of any organization that has a DEI program. That's the place where it should be. It should be examining the behavior of every department and have the authority to require that departments change their behavior and do things differently, and departments should be evaluated on how well they cooperate with the DEI vice president and their team, because they should have a staff and they should have a budget. If you want to know what an organization's values is, all you have to do is look at where their money goes. What do they spend the most money on? That's what's most valuable to them. What department gets the most money? That's what's most valuable to them. And you will see that DEI is almost always the smallest budget, if it even has its own budget. Right now, there being lots of layoffs, and who's getting laid off a lot? People in human resources and DEI. Probably also communications and operations, because those are the places that organizations think they don't need, even though they really do need them. They're basically the spine of an organization. You break those things up, everything else falls down. But organizations usually put all their money into their programs. If it's nonprofit, for profit, it's usually R&D and tech and areas like that. But they don't put it into HR, and they definitely don't put it into DEI. So you're always dealing with programs that are underserved, understaffed, underfunded, and then they're expected to institute accountability for discrimination and racism and foster diversity, equity, inclusion. That's impossible. So what I want you to understand is that if you're a person of color, if you're Black, especially if you're a Black woman, DEI ain't for you, boo. Don't go to DEI thinking that it's going to make any difference, or that they're going to help you, or that they're going to make your organization change, because 9 times out of 10, they're not going to. It's there to make the organization look good and to look as if they're doing something. A lot of CEOs love to do a victory lap around DEI. I've worked with many of them, and that's really what it's about for them, to be able to go back to their board and say, oh, look what we're doing, when in fact they're doing nothing or doing very little to institute change, right? And so you have to understand that, like HR, you should expect very little out of DEI when you are in a situation where you're being discriminated against at work or being subjected to any other problematic behavior. Whether they have a DEI program or not is not going to make any difference in terms of addressing your issue. What will make a difference is properly documenting your workplace, keeping documentation that proves the discrimination that you are experiencing, and effectively presenting those issues to human resources and removing yourself with a severance check. That, in my opinion, is the best way to go. Thinking that you can go to them and then they're going to fix the problem is a fool's errand. So if you take nothing else away from this, I want you to remember, you may have DEI in your organization, but it ain't for you, boo. This is Anne Marie, the anti-HR HR lady, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.